Good.
Yes.
All right. Thank you. Well, thank you, Jess. As just mentioned, my name is Alan Kallmeyer. I'm chair of mechanical engineering. I've been chair here for, about, I think 16 years now. So been managing budgets for a while. And so I'm going to talk a little bit today about, I guess, the different types of budgets, different types of funds that are available, how money can and cannot be spent, and maybe offer up some tips and suggestions for managing those budgets based on based on the way we do things in mechanical engineering, and not necessarily to say that that's necessarily the best way for everybody, but it might be useful for you, or you again may have better methods for doing that yourself. I'm asking Jess to kind of monitor the chat. I'm not always good at that during this presentation, but if any questions come up, please either put them into the chat window or just blurt them out and interrupt me, because I want to make sure that we get any questions addressed, or if you have any comments or suggestions about the way you do things, it's great. Let's have a conversation here. So first of all, there's a lot of different types of funds that are available, and I'm kind of going to go through some of these as we go through the slides, and talk about what they mean, where the money comes from, and how those funds can be used. So we of course have state appropriated funds. Some of the programs have differential tuition, which can be a big source of revenue for those programs. There's the restricted funds. Those would be like your grant and contracts, any kind of research funding, as well as any restricted donations that come in from departments. So those have specific uses tied to them. And then a lot of what we call kind of the local funds, things like indirect cost returns, that's money that's returned back from research funding, funds from the foundation that we get from our donors, for example, course and lab fees, those are being phased out, but there's a few programs that still have some course and lab fees. Summer school offerings, which provide a good stream of revenue for some programs that have a lot of students in summer classes. Recharge centers for programs that have equipment that can maybe be used and loaned out, and so to speak, rented out, that can provide a pretty good source of funding as well. So we'll kind of talk through these different sources as we go, and again, kind of really focusing on what's the best way to use those funds that makes the most sense. So let's start with the appropriated funds, because this tends to be the primary source of funding, source of revenue for most departments, right? We all have appropriated funds that come from the state. Those are the funds that provide your salaries for your faculty, your staff. Those tend to be like the fixed lines, the permanent lines. Many programs also have pool positions, which can be used to fund, some of your part-time adjunct faculty, students, TAs, and those types of things, any other kind of temporary staff. The nice thing about using the appropriated funds for salaries is that the fringe benefits are covered kind of indirectly. You don't have to budget fringe benefits into your funding, as opposed to if you're going to use local funds to pay for salaries. So you always try to use appropriated funds as much as possible for covering salaries. So the other side of the appropriated funds are our operating budgets, right? And the operating dollars are there to cover kind of your basic operating costs. That could be office supplies, lab supplies, travel, printing, telecommunications, whatever kind of needs you have as a department. Fairly flexible in how those funds can be used. Those over time, if you're like my department, those have tended to been cut over time. Every time we have a budget cut, it seems like they take a little bit of those operating funds. So, in the case of my department, the funds we get from appropriated operating really don't cover anymore the cost of operations of our department. So you have to be creative. You have to find other ways to cover those basic operating costs that you incur. Now, also, you know, there you can do a little bit of transferring if you have some savings, say in the salary funds, and you want to shift those into operating. Usually, you can get away with some of that. That you can spend salary funds as operating. It's not quite as easy to go back the other direction, to take operating funds and use them for salaries. Not to say it can't be done, but it usually requires a little bit more levels of authorization to do that. But you do have a little bit of flexibility between those two categories of your appropriated funds. Now, differential tuition. And this is only applies to a select number of programs. So some of you, if you don't have differential tuition, you can kind of ignore this part. But the differential tuition was a policy that was put in place a number of years ago by the state board. And I've given you the description right out of the state board policy manual there on the slide, that tuition may be assessed in differential tuition tiers, rates that differ by academic program or course subject based on programmatic needs. So the differential tuition, or DT as we abbreviate it, that is money it's basically students enrolled in those programs pay a higher rate of tuition, and that money goes directly to the program that those students are enrolled in. And the intent is for programs that have higher costs associated with them as part of the delivery of education. Those programs have higher costs, so the students are going to need to pay a little bit extra. So that might include things like covering lab equipment. So we have, in engineering, we have a lot of labs, and we have to purchase equipment. We have to maintain that equipment. We have to calibrate that equipment. We have high computer needs, computer software licenses that we buy. With all of the labs that we run, there's quite a few TAs that we have to hire. So typically our TAs, our graders, if we need to hire adjunct faculty, additional support staff for our students and so on, those are all the uses that you can use for the differential tuition funds. Based on the state board policy, it's really left very wide open on how those funds may be used. And so different programs kind of have a different view of it. I've always sort of taken the theory that since this is money that's paid directly by students enrolled in your program, that however you spend it should be benefiting the educational experience of the students. So whenever we're looking at spending differential tuition funds, I always ask myself first and foremost, how will that benefit the students? And if there's no direct benefit to the students, then I won't use DT for it. So it's really, I don't use DT to cover any kind of research costs or anything outside of that educational environment. And that's the philosophy that we have taken. And I think at present, it's engineering and computer science, nursing, business, pharmacy, architecture, and landscape architecture, I believe, that are the programs that have been authorized for differential tuition. And it takes approval by the state board for a program to be able to charge differential tuition. So there's a process that you have to go through. But I believe at the present time, those are the programs here at NDSU that are benefiting from differential tuition. In our case, that is our largest source of revenue by far, is differential tuition. That's how we fund most operations in our program. Now, there's restricted funds. So restricted funds can be a couple different categories. Those are your for example, the research funds like grants and contracts. Whenever you have a research project that you're working, that will be set up as a restricted fund. And so the restricted funds, of course, can only be used in accordance with the budget that you have established and within the defined time frame. So there's a period of performance. You have budget categories that you've defined based on the research grant. and you have to stick to those categories. Now, if you want to or need to redistribute funding between categories, that is allowed as long as the sponsoring agency approves it. And so there's a process to go through to allow a redistribution on the budget. And that is all handled through our grant and contract accounting office. And those folks are great over there. Ann Young and her team have been very good about, making sure that the rules are followed. And that's really the key is they do a lot of checking to make sure when there's expenditures associated with a grant, that those expenditures are allowed by the grant and they're within your budget and they're within the right category of your budget. And so those types of funds are routinely audited. We get audited quite frequently from grant and contract accounting. They'll randomly pull an expenditure and ask us to provide the proof of receipt of equipment or supplies or whatever it was that we bought, and they're doing that to maintain so that we're in compliance with the funding agency. So we never want to be out of compliance. And so they're very good about checking that. And you have to understand that they're checking their audits are not because they don't trust you, but because it's the funding agency that they're trying to make sure that they're satisfying. In addition to grant and contracts, sometimes, a department, a program might receive a donation directly from an alum or from a company where they send you a check and they say, hey, we want this money to be used in this way. Those types of donations, the preferred route is to run those through the foundation. Sometimes people don't want to do that, right? They know that the foundation is going to take their 5% and they don't want 5% to go anywhere else. And so they will send it directly to the department. If that's the case, then when we get a donation like that, we will then send that to grant and contract accounting and have them set that up as a restricted fund. And so again, those funds can only be used by the intent of the donor that provided them. And so that it is possible to have restricted funds that are not specifically tied to a grant or contract. Indirect cost returns. So for those programs that have good, good research portfolios, the indirect cost returns can be a nice source of revenue. So all grants, all proposals that get submitted, or I'll say most of them, have, in addition to the direct costs, there's a set of indirect costs that are charged. And the current rate that NDSU abides by is 45% of the total or modified total direct costs. So you figure out your direct costs associated with your grant, add 45% of that. That's your overhead, indirect, or facilities and administrative, F&A costs, all the same thing. Of that 45% that gets charged onto the funding agency, 42% of that 45% comes back to the college that generated that research. What the college decides to do with it is dependent on the dean and the policy within that college. And every college operates a little bit differently. In engineering, a portion of that money that comes back to the college gets distributed back to the department of the PI where that money was generated. So those policies will differ based on what the policies of your dean is. But that money that comes back is very good for helping programs to sustain their research programs. And so we will use that money basically to support our research enterprise. So I might use those funds to support a junior faculty member that needs to travel to a conference, or they might need some lab supplies or some equipment to as seed money to get their research up and going. Or you might have a senior faculty member that's in between grants and needs some help covering some research expenses in between. So again, it's the IDCs that come back are really fairly unrestricted, but philosophically, the intent is you should use those funds to kind of enhance what you're doing on the research side. And as incentive to my faculty, one of the policies we've adopted in my department is for all of the indirect costs that come back into my program, a percentage of those go back to the PI that generated that money. So some of it stays in the department that I can use to support departmental needs, but some of it goes back and becomes the responsibility of the PI. They have then the authority to spend those funds as best they see fit. So they don't need necessarily my okay. They can use those funds as they want. And so that's a little bit of maybe a little bit of a reward or incentive for faculty to go out and generate research funds that they're going to get on the back end. They're going to get some of that money back to spend it as they need. The foundation funds. So we just had yesterday, we just went through our giving day and had a nice return from many of our friends, our donors, our alumni. And so most of the time when donations come in, those donations go to the foundation. So that those funds might be from alumni, they might be from corporations, other foundations, or just friends of the university. Often those funds are restricted based on donor intent. So a lot of donors will want those funds to go into scholarships or a professorship, or they want it to go to a specific program. And so they will tag those funds for that particular intent. Sometimes they come in as unrestricted, maybe directed towards a particular department, but not necessarily having any strings attached as to how that department can use it. So then it might just go into a general purpose fund for departmental use. Those foundation funds are great. Again, you have to spend the money according to donor intent. But for the ones that come in as that unrestricted, those are great funds for whatever your needs are, whether they're educational needs or research needs. Sometimes we'll use those to help faculty development, send faculty out to conferences, or again, buying equipment. We might use those funds to help students who are traveling to competitions. So it's just a wide variety of uses there. Those foundation funds, typically there's two categories. They can be placed into what we call a directly spendable account. So the money comes in and it goes out. So whatever comes in, that's how much money you have to spend. The larger gifts might be set up as endowments. And an endowment, basically, you're not spending the principal, you're only spending the interest that accrues. Currently, I believe the foundation is returning roughly 4% annually on the principal amount as the spendable. And of course, in good years, the return on investment is going to be greater than that. So the principal might grow. In down years, it might be a little less and your principal might shrink a little bit. But the foundation, I think overall lately has been a great steward of our money. And so we've seen a real boon in the money that coming from the foundation, and it's really been very helpful in supporting our program. And so that's been a great source of revenue. And then some of the other funds, which may or may not, in your particular department, you may or may not have access to. Course and lab fees. Now, these used to be very prevalent at NDSU. Many lab courses had a fee associated with them that students would have to pay extra when they enrolled in that particular class or lab. Most of those were phased out a number of years ago. And the idea was that money was sort of built into the base tuition. It's to make it easier, so there's fewer surprises for students. They didn't sometimes realize that certain courses had big fees associated with them. And so they complained a lot about kind of these hidden course fees. So most of those have been phased out, not all of them. Some classes, because of their specific nature, do have an additional fee assessed with them. We try to be very upfront. I've got one class in my program that has a fee assessed with it because it's an aviation course. It's not part of our regular curriculum. We offer it as a service to the university, and basically it's learn how to fly, how to become a pilot. And we have a fee associated with it because that class has to be taught by a licensed pilot. None of our faculty are licensed pilots, so I have to hire somebody outside to teach that class. So those course fees pay for that instructor's salary. But those are rare anymore. Now, summer school, on the other hand, is a great revenue source for those departments that offer classes during the summer and have the ability to attract high enrollments. Summer school classes must be self-supporting. So basically, you need to have enough enrollment in the class to pay the instructor's salary. Once that instructor's salary has been covered, a portion of the excess funds can get returned back to the department to spend however you see fit. And so if you're good at marketing your summer classes and you can attract a lot of students, and I think with the proliferation now of online courses during the summer, that I think has enhanced our enrollments. I know it has in our program, that this might be a good source of revenue going forward, is to make a little bit of extra money through summer school. And then another type of revenue source are through recharge centers or service centers. And for departments that have laboratory equipment that might be of value to other units on campus or to offsite external users, local companies or other institutions or whatever, you can set that equipment. You can define and establish a recharge center and set a rate for use of that equipment. Now, the way that rate gets set is that you set it to basically cover the cost of the equipment. You're not allowed to make a profit on a recharge center internally, okay, by charging other users internal to campus. You're not supposed to make a profit off that. You're basically defining a rate so you break even, so that you break even in terms of whatever your annual maintenance, calibration costs. If you've got consumables and supplies that go along with that equipment, you're trying to set a break even rate. The nice thing about it, though, is that by bringing in that revenue, it now establishes that money, that those funds there to cover the cost of the equipment. So you don't have to take those maintenance fees out of other sources. Now, you can't make money internally, but on the external side, for external users, you can charge a surplus, like an indirect cost or an overhead rate that does actually allow you to make a little bit of extra money. And that's nice for because sometimes you need to make upgrades, or you have to do a software upgrade, or you need new pieces of equipment that go along with your existing equipment, or periodically you need to replace equipment. So that the external sources do allow you to accrue a little bit of external funding for those purposes, as long as you're not competing with other local companies, right? So you can't be in competition with our private companies by undercutting their rates. So you have to set rates for external users that are on par with what would be kind of rates in the community by local companies. So that's kind of the overview of the different types of funds. So now more into the management side and how we do things. And again, this is kind of how we do things in our department. We've established over the years some policies, some procedures that I think work well for us. Again, they may not work well for everybody, but these are some of my recommendations. I'd be happy for anybody else to chip in if you've got other ideas as we talk through these. in terms of the tracking budget, so all of our funds are maintained in the PeopleSoft financial module, and hopefully all departments have staff that have access to the financial module. I myself never go in there. I just get lost and mess something up. So I leave that to my staff. We recommend, though, maintaining separate spreadsheets for tracking funds. So every fund that we have, whether it's a research fund, a local fund, our appropriated funds, our differential tuition funds, we keep a separate set of books, and we use Excel. But that is because that allows us to be more consistent and up to date. So we know exactly how much money we've got available, as opposed to going into PeopleSoft where there's a lag, right? And we can, using our Excel books, we can encumber expenses out through the whole year that we know we're going to incur. And so it gives us a much more real-time, up-to-date tracking process for where we're at. And then periodically, our staff will go back into PeopleSoft and obviously reconcile. So we make sure that what our local books are showing is the same as what PeopleSoft is showing. We've set up, and especially on the research side, some Excel spreadsheets that are set up exactly like the accounts get set up in PeopleSoft, with all the same budget categories. And it allows us to basically put the expenses into the Excel sheet. They get tagged into the appropriate category. And it's been a great way for us to kind of keep track of those expenses. And especially when you've got, 30 or 40 research projects that you might have going on, keeping track of all those can be really challenging. And so this is why I really want to emphasize that last bullet point, that for this purpose, the administrative support is just critical. Having good account technicians, I've got 2 of them in my department, and that know what they're doing, that they're tracking things, they're serving as an extra check on our expenditures, making sure that faculty aren't overextending their research grants, and being able to encumber expenses ahead of time, warn faculty as they're getting low in a certain category, tell faculty, no, you can't spend that money that way. It's not set up in your budget correctly. It's just critical that we have adequate staff resources for those purposes. I just can't emphasize that enough. Now, with the expenditures, I think departments do this differently. And I'm going to use the example of research grants, because I know there's big differences among departments, and I call it more of a distributed model versus a centralized model with how you might authorize expenditures. Where I would classify a distributed model as one in which faculty have a lot more flexibility, and maybe even students, to initiate their own purchases, right? So a faculty member has a grant. Many departments will issue them a purchasing card that they can use to buy their own supplies or equipment, or use it for travel and those types of things. That's a very convenient method for faculty. It's quick, it's easy. They don't need any authorization. They can just go out and spend the money. From our standpoint, we've always felt using that type of model that accountability and tracking gets to be a little more challenging. When you get the invoice down the road and you wonder, what the heck did this go to? Who's spent this money? What grant is it associated with? So it can be a little more challenging from that perspective. So we've adopted a more centralized model for authorizing expenditures, where our account technicians do all of the purchasing. They do all of the transactions. They initiate every purchase. So if a faculty wants to make a purchase for a grant, they have to fill out what's called a pre-order form. They submit it to the account tech. The account tech does the purchasing, and then they've got all the paperwork, and the invoice will come to them, and they will know where that product is in all stages, whether it's been ordered, has it been shipped, has it been received. Has it been paid for? It's I will admit that it's less convenient for faculty because they have to submit this pre-order form and then wait for things to happen. But faculty can be trained, and we've trained our faculty to do that. And once they get used to it, they're very good about following those policies, and it's worked very well for us. And it's again on that accountability side, and especially with these research grants, as I mentioned before, these things get audited very regularly. And again, it's not a bad thing. This is just part of the responsibilities of our grant and contract accounting, is to make sure that these restricted funds are being spent in an appropriate manner, because we don't want NSF coming back to us and saying that we spent this money inappropriately and now we need to go back and try to rectify the situation. It's a lot easier if we can catch things up front than down the road. And so we get this on a routine basis where GCA will come to us and say, hey, show us the documentation you have on this particular purchase. And with our method, with the paperwork that we have, we've got a very solid paper trail. Our account techs can go back, they can pull out that transaction, they can pull out the invoice, they can show where it's been, the equipment or materials have been received, and demonstrate that, yep, that was a legitimate purchase for that grant. So that is all a routine part of maintaining these grants. And this happens more frequently, on the restricted funds, as opposed to your local funds, which have a lot.
I am not sure if I'm lost or if Alan is lost. Can somebody else unmute? Am I live? Looks like Alan got kicked out, maybe.
You're live.
Okay. Thank you. If you guys, looks like he's coming back. Okay. Hi, Alan.
Can you hear me now?
Yes. Yes.
Okay.
Welcome back.
I apologize. I've been having some instabilities with my internet, so maybe it just dropped me out there. I apologize. Okay, I'm going to try sharing screen again. All right, are we back onto the audit page there?
Yes, you are.
Okay. Okay, so I don't know at what point I lost sound, but I had been talking about the internal audits that are handled through grant and contract accounting. And I was mentioning that external audits sometimes occur, comes through the state auditor's office. We have been through some of these where we've had auditors come in and they want to look at all of our expenditures for a certain account, like our differential tuition account, for the last several months. And you just got to come up with a whole lot of documentation. And that's why it's really important in these situations to maintain that documentation, having records of all of the purchases. We do in transactions, probably a couple hundred or more per month of purchases. And that's between research grants. It's also between our senior design projects. All of our senior design groups get their own budget and they can purchase things. And so we do a high number of transactions, a high volume. And I sign off on every one of those because the buck stops here. It's kind of the way it works. But maintaining that documentation and having that procedure in place is just very important in case you ever are audited. And so again, for that purpose, administrative support is just critical. I just cannot emphasize enough how important it is to have good quality staff and a sufficient number of staff. And I know with budget cuts that some of our units have lost staff positions, and that gets to be a problem, quite honestly, as you all know. So some of the recommendations on budget spending. Of course, appropriated funds have to be spent down annually, right? And the fiscal year runs from July 1st to June 30th. And so that's always, we start planning that out a couple months in advance, looking at, we'll get into mid-spring and start looking at June 30th and making sure that we've got a plan to spend all of those funds down. Usually that's not a difficult plan, right? It's spending the money is easy enough. But also at the beginning of the year, kind of keeping track of things to make sure you're going to have enough to last through the end of the year. And that's why it's kind of a good practice to encumber those expenses, things that that are going to be every month you're going to spend so much on telecommunications and so on printing, on copying. Budget those things out so that you don't run out of money earlier. As I'd mentioned, using appropriated funds whenever possible for salaries, because if you're paying salary out of an appropriated fund, you don't have to cover the fringe benefits. If you're using a local fund, whether that's indirect, overhead returns or differential tuition or whatever, you have to pay fringe benefits. And for full-time faculty and staff, that's a big number, right? That can range 30 to 50% depending on the salary for a faculty or staff position. So it's a big bonus to use appropriated funds for salaries as opposed to local funds. For your other funds that you do have, local funds, even differential tuition falls in this category. Most of those others you can carry balance over across fiscal years. However, we try to avoid carrying large balances across the fiscal year because then the optics of that are not always great. When we're going to the legislature saying we need more money, and they look in our account balances at the beginning of the year and they say, well, you carried over hundreds of thousands of dollars in these local funds or millions of dollars, they say you don't need any more money. And so there is of course, you want to maintain some flexibility there. And sometimes you're planning ahead, you have a large purchase coming up, so you need to carry some over, and that's okay. Sometimes you're asked to justify it, but as much as possible, trying to spend those local funds down to a reasonable level so we're not carrying big balances across that fiscal year. When dealing with faculty, and a lot of questions often arise about transparency. How open should you be in your budget, and how transparent should you be? I've always said transparency is the best policy, right? If anybody wants to know, any faculty member wants to know in our department, how is this money being spent? I'll open the books. I'll show them. You can look at anything. I'm going to hide nothing. Are there limits to that policy? And I don't say that meaning like, let's hide things. I found, when I started as chair, I probably was a little more, forthcoming with the books in our faculty meetings. And I'd show a lot of charts that would show, hey, last year, here's where all the money went. This year, here's how we're budgeting it. And what I found was a lot of times, a lot of faculty they didn't care about that level of detail. And so it just depends. Some faculty want to see, where's that money going? You never want to make sure, you never want faculty to feel like that you're not being equal, and you're treating some faculty differently by giving them more funds for a certain purpose than another faculty. And so I do think it's critical to maintain that equity, that if you're going to provide travel funds to one faculty member, you need to be prepared to provide those same travel funds to another faculty member. And that can be a challenge. Sometimes you don't have enough. You don't have enough money to go around. And so you might have to develop a rotation. This year, half my faculty get travel funds. Next year, the other half. However you need to work that out. The key is making sure that everybody does understand how the money is being spent. If they want to see how that money is being spent, be open, be forthcoming, show them. But then at the same time, if they don't care, don't waste their time. And I think that part of that just comes through is once they get to that comfort level to know that you're spending that money thoughtfully and equally, then maybe they're not so concerned about seeing all of the details. So those are some of those recommendations. And then lastly, revenue generation, right? In an era of budget cuts, how can we make money? How can we supplement what we get? Because our appropriations are going down as enrollment drops, differential tuition goes down. And so we're seeing budget cuts in different arenas. So these ideas don't necessarily apply to all programs, but if they do, it's a good way to bring in some extra money. And they're mostly things I talked about. Recharge centers. This is a great way to recoup that cost of maintenance, the operating costs on equipment, calibration equipment for those programs that have research equipment that might be of value to other units. Again, you're not trying to necessarily make money, but what you're trying to do is just generate a revenue stream that allows you to cover the maintenance costs so that you don't have to take that money from other sources. Again, from externally, you can make a little bit of revenue that way. That's not the point. Again, the point really is to cover the cost of the use of the equipment, the operation of the equipment. And to set up a recharge center, you could contact the folks over at Grant and Contracted Accounting. They can walk you through that process. It does take a little bit of time to set that up. You have to establish the equipment rates, which means you have to do some projecting, and those have to be adjusted every year. So there's some time and maintenance that goes along with the service center as well. But once you get it set up, it's a great thing to have. Summer school, again. If you can market your summer school and get higher enrollments, that's a way to make a little bit of extra revenue for departments once you've covered the instructor salaries. Of course, research grants, contracts, that's how we support a lot of our graduate students. And the overhead that comes back off of that, again, is a way to support our research enterprise in the department. And then there's other kind of services or sales, so to speak, that departments can maybe do. In our program, as an example, we'll help with some testing services. So we have a lot of material testing equipment. And if there's a local company that needs some tests run, they can come in and use our equipment. It actually kind of ties back to the service centers. But that provides a little bit of a stream of revenue into our program. You got to be careful to make sure those types of activities don't conflict with your research activities, right? Research always takes priority. But if the equipment is sitting idle and a company needs it, help them out and make a little bit of money off of that. As I mentioned, you cannot unfairly compete with local businesses. So your rates have to be set to be competitive with what a local company might charge for the same service. You cannot undercut their business. And then, of course, donations, right? Giving Day. That was a great way to bring a little bit of extra revenue into the department. And that all goes into that cultivation of donors. And we heard from Monique a couple of weeks ago on the great work that the foundation does. And I think we all need to be very cognizant about how, the students that we're educating now, those are our future alumni. And they're going to be hopefully responsible for providing donations back to our programs in the future. So keeping that in mind is always, I try to remember that, hey, these are our future donors that we're educating now. So let's let them leave on a good note rather than a bad note. So yeah, those are my those are my slides, my talk. I maybe talked a little bit more than I wanted, but are there other questions or comments or suggestions that anybody might have like to add to this? Erica, you have a couple questions. Go ahead.
Can you guys hear me?
I can. Yeah, go ahead.
Okay, my video is not working. So two questions. So for summer school funding distribution for departments with 12-month appointments. So in animal science, we have 12-month appointments for those faculty. What does that look like for funding distribution? Because our salaries essentially would already be covered by our existing position.
So I'm sorry, Eric, I'm not hearing your question really well.
I will type it in the chat.
Okay, that might help. I don't know if you're cutting out or if it's my sound that's cutting out. While Erica is typing, are there any other questions? Oh, okay. For 12-month faculty who teach summer school, what does the funding redistribution look like to the departments? That's a good question, and I do not have a good answer because I don't know if faculty can get overload for teaching summer school. Maybe somebody else, maybe Margaret there can answer that question.
Yes. So if you're on a 12-month contract and teaching during the summer is part of that regular load, it is covered under your regular appropriated salary. What we do in the provost's office is we issue summer school contracts for faculty to teach courses that meet minimum enrollments. And then we pay that through our appropriated summer school money. And if there's money left over at the end of the summer, we distribute that back out to departments based on student credit hour production. Summer school used to have more incentives to do that than it does now because with budget cuts, our summer school budget has also been cut. So what we try to do is retain enough funding that we can cover faculty contracts for what students need and what faculty want to teach. And if there's anything left to distribute, that's just the icing on the cake, but it does help faculty to teach in the summer and students to get what they need. If a faculty member is teaching overload though, whether it's on a 9, 10, 11 or 12-month contract, if it's not something that's part of your regular load, you can get additional compensation for overload. I haven't really seen that in summer school, though, with the contracts we've done, that someone is on a 12-month contract and is also overloading, but perhaps it just hasn't come across my desk. Departments and colleges can also opt to teach courses in the summer that the provost office isn't covering. So if we have a 20 student minimum enrollment on an undergraduate class, but there's something your students really need, you only have 7 of them. If the department or the college has money to do that, they can do their own contract with the faculty member to teach. So not all summer session teaching goes through the provost's office. Am I making sense, or do you have other questions?
Oh, on a separate question, what does a tax receipt look like, or who or where does a receipt come from when a donor gives directly to the department? So I'll tell you what we've done and what we've been told we can do. And thank you, Margaret, for jumping in there and rescuing me. So if we get a donation that comes directly to the department, we will basically issue a letter of acknowledgement, thanking the donor for the contribution. So it will be very similar to what you would get if you donate to a charity, and they'll provide you a letter acknowledging the amount of the donation. If it's a cash, that's easy. If it's sometimes we get pieces of equipment donated to us, and we have to sort of estimate what we think the value of that is. So we will state that in the letter, and we can state that no goods or services were provided for that donation. And so it gives that donor that record that they did in fact donate to us. And so that's what we've done. We've just provided them kind of a generic letter thanking them for the donation of that amount. If that answers your question there, Erica. All right, anything else? Well, it looks like I think we're maybe kind of at the end of our time anyway. So thank you all for attending. And if you do have other questions and you want to chat with me at any time, don't hesitate to reach out to me, give me a call or shoot me an email, and we can chat. So thanks, everybody.
Thanks so much, Alan. Thanks for your time and your insight. Have a great week.
All right, bye-bye.